Welcome, Bir Singh Khalsa.
Thank you.
We're very happy to have you here. Thank you, Panchnishan.
Thank you, Selene, Shanti Surya.
And yeah, we're gonna have for this liftoff Bir with us. Liftoff is a series of dialogues that has been created with Tom and Nadine Michelberger in the midst of the silence of the lockdown a couple of months ago. And the goal is to emulate conversations on radical shifts that we feel needs to happen on the society level, the earth level, and the self.
So we're so really honored and thrilled to have you as part of these conversations and an important voice in these times. Satbir, I had the pleasure to work with you on the Kundalini Research Institute Board of Directors, where you sit as a director of research. Satbir is a neuroscientist with researcher specifically in the mind-body field, mind-body medicine. And since 2006, as an assistant professor of medicine at Harvard Medical School. Currently a director of yoga research at Yoga Alliance, the largest network of yoga teachers with over 90,000 members. And really, we look forward to this conversation together today.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
So to start with, we're curious a bit about your journey. I know you've been personally a yogi and meditator for over 40 years. And we want to know how your lifestyle, your background as a yogi and meditator crossed with your academic career. And when did these two things merge into your profession?
Right. So I was always interested in science and took science in university and studied science. But at the same time, I was also starting the practice of yoga. And so those two things sort of, one transitioned and the other one started. I moved into an ashram in 1973 and began a full yoga lifestyle as a practitioner and teacher and living in the ashram. And I just became an ashram member. But a couple of years later, my interest in science started to resurface and reassert itself. And so I set a new goal for myself. Instead of studying what I was studying before, which was sort of physics and astronomy, was to change into the idea that I wanted to study these contemplative states of consciousness that yoga could produce. So in 1975, I set the goal of wanting to become a researcher, which meant going back to school, getting a PhD, and going through the whole process. So I started that, and of course I had to do conventional research because there was nobody doing yoga research at that time that I could work with as a graduate student. I graduated from the University of Toronto with my PhD, and still there were no opportunities really for conducting research on yoga. And so I went into a field of interest, which was sleep and circadian biology, and studied that for many years, transitioned from where I was to the United States, and then ultimately took a position at Harvard Medical School studying sleep and circadian rhythms. And then around that time, in the year 2000, we have an agency, the National Center for Complementary and Integrative Health, that was funding research on integrative medicine. So I wrote a grant, and I was fortunate enough to get a Research Career Award in 2001. So I have been fortunate in actually starting my yoga research then and maintaining full-time research since then. So between the time that I set the goal of wanting to do research on yoga and the time that it was actually happening was 25 years. So that says something about patience in science and in a scientific career. But I have been very fortunate in doing that since 2001. And I've really established sort of three areas in my career. One, of course, is actually conducting research. And so, I've looked at research on yoga for sleep, for performance anxiety, for post-traumatic stress disorder, for generalized anxiety disorder. And then more recently, yoga in the public schools and then yoga in the workplace. So I'm still involved in that kind of research directly in terms of conducting the research and publishing it. But two other areas that I have really embraced have been sort of collaborating with colleagues around the world. And that has led me to run a symposium on yoga research annually for the past 10 years. And so that's sort of a policy role that I've adopted of a promotion of research in yoga and collaboration and interaction with other yoga researchers internationally. So that's a very interesting area for me, and the whole promotion of yoga research is very important for society. And the other thing that I have moved into as well, which is tied to that, is really education. And that's mostly education of people who practice yoga or teach yoga, to convey what we call research literacy, the science that we have behind how yoga works. And that is a very valuable piece of knowledge and a body of knowledge that is very valuable for both teachers and students, because the teachers now have a new language to talk about how yoga works. Instead of using sort of yoga language, talking about prana and kundalini and chakras, now we can talk about scientific things that are really the language of modern society. Things like self-regulation and resilience and mindfulness and so on. And this now gives us sort of a real, a language that can be understood. So when we walk into a medical clinic and offer to teach yoga, we can now explain from a scientific medical perspective why yoga is valuable to the patients in that clinic. So those are the sort of three areas of my, work with yoga. And I'm fortunate enough to be traveling internationally substantially, except for the COVID situation. But I have been traveling extensively internationally, giving lectures at conferences and a lot of workshops actually to yoga teachers.
So you're truly a pioneer of this field, and it's amazing to hear how it's developed and how it's developing and its importance in society that you mentioned. And on that topic, we'd love to hear from you. When you look at modern society, what do you see the role of yoga and meditation as?
So I think that yoga has enormous benefits. It makes people function better on many levels. And I think that yoga is being adopted substantially by society over the past 15, 20 years. The surveys have shown that the popularity of yoga is growing very dramatically. We have surveys in the United States that show that most recently 14% of the US population is actively practicing yoga. And so that's marvelous, and that trend is almost exponential. And we have surveys from other countries as well that are somewhat similar. But the problem is that the demographics of that practice is very limited. And what I mean by that is that it's usually 75 to 80% women. It's mostly people who are middle-aged and healthy. And the other thing that goes along with that is that the media portrays yoga as something that is practiced by thin, rich, middle-aged white females in leotards. And of course, we know that yoga can be practiced by children. It can be practiced by the elderly. It can be practiced by men. And it can be practiced by people with medical limitations. And so this is a problem that we face in the yoga community, that we have an image issue, that yoga really is for everybody, and we need to be able to communicate that. And so I think research can play a role. And what I'd like to sort of convey, I'll share a slide which sort of conveys this idea. And see if I can pull it up. Can you see this slide?
No, unfortunately not.
Okay, hang on just a sec. I'm still working on this. Oh, here we go. Okay, you can see this slide.
Yes,
so
now we can.
We are experiencing right now this grassroots movement of yoga. So it's being practiced in ashrams and studios and yoga centers and gyms and spas, and that's growing dramatically. And what we want to get to is we want to yoga into mainstream society. We want everybody to get it. And when we talk about mainstream society, what we're really referring to at mainstream society's institutions. And these are the public schools, the workplaces, and the healthcare system. Now, of course, if you bring yoga into the public schools, all of the children will get it. The entire population will get it eventually if you were able to bring it into the public schools. So this idea of implementing yoga into the mainstream, into these institutions, would really solve this problem and really get yoga to everyone. And so we're starting to see this already in a grassroots way. There are some schools that are including yoga. There are some workplaces, and there is a little bit of implementation in healthcare. But if you really want this implementation to take place, what's really necessary is the research. So a school will not implement yoga into its curriculum unless there's evidence that it's safe and that it's effective and that it's worth replacing something else in the school curriculum with yoga. The same with the workplace. An employer is going to want to know return on investment. If I'm going to allow my employees 3 hours a week to practice yoga, I want to know that there's going to be less absence due to illness. There's going to be more productivity. There's going to be more creativity. There's going to be less conflict, and there's going to be less job turnover. And the same is true, of course, in the healthcare system. The healthcare system won't allow you to teach yoga to patients unless they know it's safe and that there's going to be some benefits. So research is really critical to make this very powerful transition into mainstream society happen. So I think that's why I think that yoga research is so important at this point in time.
Mm-hmm. And before delving into details a little bit more in these three areas that you mentioned that are where your research is fascinating, if we come back to the level of the society, could you guide us through the domino effect of duality, like this us versus them or this I versus them? What's the domino effect from an individual level up to a society, up to nation leaders? And vice versa, then can you guide us through the one of oneness?
Right. So, I mean, this is really talking about how does yoga create those kinds of physical and psychological and emotional changes in individuals. And so I'm going to show another slide, which is hopefully going to show us that characteristic. And this is really a model of how we believe that and how we understand from modern science how yoga works. Now, when I'm talking about yoga, we have to be clear. I'm not just talking about asanas. I'm not just talking about physical postures, because there's a lot of people when they practice yoga, they do nothing but asanas, and it's just a workout kind of thing. Traditional yoga, of course, incorporates not just postures and exercises, but also the pranayama, the breathing techniques, the deep relaxation practices, the progressive relaxation, the shavasana, yoga nidra, and then very importantly, the meditative component. And perhaps the meditative component is the most important component in traditional yoga. And in fact, an argument can be made that the physical components are really there to support the meditative component. So yoga as a traditional practice incorporates all of these things. And that's what you get when you go to a traditional yoga class. Now, on the physical level, all of these things are producing changes in the physical body. And I'm calling this improvements in physical, in what I'm calling fitness. So that's things like flexibility, strength, coordination, balance, certainly respiratory function. Now, through the mind-body connection, as you improve the body, that has effects on the mind. So that improves your sort of overall self-efficacy as a human being. Another thing that comes from all four of these practices is what we call self-regulation. And that's a skill. It's the ability to control your internal state, both physiological, physiological, as well as psychological. And the most important psychological components are really the ability to manage and regulate stress and the ability to manage and regulate emotions. And as you practice over time and develop this skill, that leads to resilience to stress, tolerance of stress, and equanimity in the face of the ups and downs of emotions. And that leads to an overall psychological self-efficacy. Now, it's primarily through the meditative component that we increase our awareness, mind-body awareness. That's also been called and become very, very popular in society as mindfulness. What we do in meditation, of course, is we focus our attention on some kind of target. And that develops the ability to control your attention. And that improves, that engages the attention networks. And over time, you improve your cognition and your concentration. But over time, what meditation leads to is a state we call metacognition. The realization and understanding that although we have thoughts, that's not who we are. We are above our thoughts. That's what the meta means. In other words, we have thoughts, but that's not who we are. And that also implies that we have some degree of control over those thoughts. And as metacognition develops with meditation practice, you come to the understanding that you can react differently to your thoughts. You now have a choice. In fact, you can even change your thought processes. And so that ability of sort of self-regulation of thought processes is really critical. And this is what Patanjali's Yoga Sutras really talk about when he's talking about meditation and its benefits. Now, as people meditate, and typically this occurs more over a period of sort of months or years of regular practice, people start to experience these unitive states of consciousness. And these may be very, very brief, but they're very profound, they're very deep. And this leads to what I'm calling a sort of a change in sort of pure spirituality. These transcendent states, this sense of flow, flowing with the rest of the universe, this deep sense of oneness, leads people to a sort of a global transformation, a change in life, meaning, and purpose. People start to view the world differently. They view themselves differently. They view their goals in life very differently. And many people will say things like, yoga changed my life. It's that profound. That is true spiritual change. And it's often associated with a change from materialistic goals in life, which we know don't lead to satisfaction, to more spiritual, uplifting goals for life. So this is a very powerful thing. Now, in terms of the research, we have very strong research on the fitness because this is very easy to measure. And through modern technology and a lot of the modern research, we've got a lot of research that's been showing improvements in stress and emotion regulation and awareness and mindfulness. And so this is really leading the charge right now. And these are very, very powerful aspects of human functioning. And because we're making these changes across a broad spectrum of human activity, all the way from sort of gross muscles and connective tissue to the deepest experiences that humans can have, we're seeing changes in global human functionality. And so that goes from the gross physical and mental health and performance level to the deeper experiences of stress and emotion regulation, awareness and mindfulness, and metacognition. These are very powerful skills. And then ultimately to the deepest sort of positive behavior changes, what we call positive psychology, positive behavior, improvements in well-being, values in life, life purpose and meaning, and this sense of pure spirituality. So I think this is sort of all on a continuum. And ultimately, these processes here allow you to become much more emotionally mature and much more aware of your own thought processes and your limitations. And ultimately, these experiences are the ones that generate this sort of unitive state of consciousness. And this is where duality disappears. This is where us versus them disappears. This is where these positive states of gratitude and compassion come from this meditative component of yoga practice. But all of these things contribute. That's what these arrows between the boxes are. So even though you're doing a physical posture, in some ways you are ultimately generating this state in the mind-body complex that leads to this unitive state of consciousness. And of course, the word yoga means union. So this is why this is so profound. And understanding the science of how this works is really allowing us to talk about this in a more informed manner.
And so, for instance, you mentioned here that unitive state, which is like a state of transformation that leads you to a deeper meaning or purpose in life. There has been some research on that, right? On individuals having materialistic goals versus having higher goals like love, contemplation, service to others. Could you summarize what has been the methodology of conducting such studies on more the spirituality, and what were some of the results?
Well, the field of positive psychology is a relatively new field, but it really deals with this whole idea that humans can improve these positive psychological characteristics through, for example, there's a Buddhist meditation for compassion, loving kindness meditation. And through doing that kind of meditation and that kind of guided imagery, you can actually change your own internal levels of compassion. You can change your emotional state to become more compassionate. And I think that comes from yoga in general as well. As you practice yoga, these states start to improve. And the whole idea of the materialistic goal, I mean, there's a whole field of psychology which does look at these sort of deeper facets. I mean, if your goal in life is to become the richest man in the world, or to become the head of a company, or the general in the army, or the most famous person in the world, we know not only from psychology, but also from ancient spiritual scriptures, that those kinds of materialistic goals, you never get satisfied. Yes, you get that Mercedes-Benz, but then you want a bigger house, and then you get the bigger house, and then you want 2 bigger houses, and it never stops. And so there's never any fulfillment from those materialistic type of goals. But once you establish these deeper spiritual goals of experiencing these deeper states, that is much more profound and everlasting, really. And it has much more to do with what we call happiness, in a sense. I mean, there's a whole field of psychology that looks at how do we achieve happiness? Who are happy people? And certainly happy people are not those people who are sort of really striving to become the richest or the most famous. And we know, I mean, for that matter, that a lot of rich people are very unhappy. So we know that money doesn't create happiness. I mean, that's sort of a hackneyed phrase, but nevertheless, it's true. I mean, it's a materialistic goal, and we know that money's never going to make you happy by itself.
So, taking another angle at the benefits of yoga and meditation, we know the benefits aren't just in the mind and experience of the devotee, but that there are also known effects that you've studied on the function of yoga and meditation on the brain in relation maybe to motor performance, to pain management, to overall state of mind and well-being. Can you share with us on that?
Sure. I mean, there's a lot of research now that's looking at the neurophysiology of how the brain works. And a lot of this work is coming from sort of neuroimaging studies, these big machines, the fMRI, where, people can, you get your head into this huge machine, and these devices can pinpoint very accurately, within a millimeter, which part of the brain is activated during meditation. And it can look from second to second. So we're starting to understand where meditation takes place in the brain and what other aspects of the brain are influenced. So we know that when we focus our attention, we're engaging what we call the prefrontal cortex. This is in the executive lobes of the brain, in the frontal lobes, where our executive functioning is. And we know that there are connections between the prefrontal cortex and the limbic system. The limbic system is the emotional brain. And these are inhibitory connections. So the more you engage the prefrontal cortex, the more you're exerting sort of a controlling effect over the limbic system. And that's what we talked about, self-regulation of stress and emotion. That's how that's happening neurophysiologically. In fact, not only are there changes in activity over time, that people who are long-term meditators and yoga practitioners have better stress and emotion regulation and more activity in the prefrontal cortex and the attention networks, but they have less activity in the limbic system because they're no longer reacting to their own thoughts. So there's another thing that happens, which is called neuroplasticity. And these are changes in brain structure as well as activity. I mean, the more you engage in a certain brain region, there's more neural connections that are made. That means there needs to be more blood flow to that region. That means that there's got to be more glial cell support. So that region of the brain actually gets larger. So the more you use a certain region of the brain, like the attention network, it gets better, and you see structural changes. And the same happens when you use things less. So in people who have long-term meditators, for example, it's been observed that their limbic system is actually structurally smaller. Because they're less reactive, they spend less time in emotional reactivity. They're more self-regulated when it comes to stress and emotion. So these are the kinds of findings that modern neurophysiology is really showing us. And another area of modern science that's very powerful, that's just starting its way into integrative medicine, is what's called epigenetics, the study of how our behavior affects our gene activity. Now, we can't change the genes themselves, but we can change gene activity. And so we're starting to see that these changes that we're seeing in stress regulation, in inflammation, in immune function, are all happening at the genetic level. When we practice yoga, we're increasing gene activity that improves immune function. And we're decreasing gene activity that's associated with a reduction in inflammation and stress. So these are very powerful sort of objective measures that are really going to move the science very, very, very strongly forward, because these are, I mean, it's a gene, and we can measure these changes in a test tube biochemically. So this is going to be very convincing as to the psychology and the neurophysiology of how these practices work.
It's really fascinating. Also on this evolutionary level, that with longer term meditators, the limbic system actually is smaller.
Yeah, and that's an amazing finding.
Yeah.
I mean, so what we're talking about is something potentially global. So as I mentioned, some of our work has been yoga in the schools. And the reason that that's so important is because our society does not have these skills. I mean, where in our culture, where in our upbringing, from our parents or our schools, did we ever learn how to self-regulate emotion or self-regulate stress? It was not part of our culture or our upbringing. And the schools don't have this. So this I view as and then also the idea of appropriate types of exercises. And most of our exercises is strictly aerobic, focused on sports or, aerobic functioning, and not so much on flexibility. And the flexibility and isometric type of exercises in yoga are more prone to inducing physical relaxation. And so I refer to yoga as a form of mind-body hygiene, if you will. This is a practice that you do this practice and you maintain your body and your mind and your spirit and your emotions at optimal functioning levels. Our society does not have any mind-body hygiene to speak of. So what we're trying to do when we bring yoga into the public schools is basically say, this is mind-body hygiene. It should be taught here. We should not only be teaching our children how to get a job and to understand history and geography and mathematics, but also how to function properly as human beings, as emotionally mature individuals. And so that's what's missing in our schools. And actually, this has been recognized by many people. It's been called socio-emotional learning. The idea that our schools are really sort of factories for producing workers, but not really good at producing people who are functioning. So yes, you'll get a job as an engineer, but you'll have depression, and you'll have anxiety, and you'll have diabetes. And because you haven't been trained how to maintain your mind and your body. So I view this as something that should be implemented in our schools. And if we can do that, if we can get yoga into every school, we can really change society on a global level. And I often ask after a lecture, I say, let's do a thought experiment. Imagine that we've succeeded in implementing yoga in every public school in the country. And this is going on from kindergarten to grade 12 throughout secondary school. And now imagine that this has happened for 3 generations. So now you have an entire society that's been trained in these mind-body practices. That's going to revolutionize our behavior as human beings. Now, human beings make up political organizations and countries. That means the countries are going to change their behavior because countries are made up of people. If people are behaving better, if they're less emotional, that means they're less greedy, that means less poverty. They're less violent, less angry, that means less war. We're talking about making a better world, because as you make better people, you make a better world. So this is not trivial, that if we can bring these mind-body hygiene practices into the global community through our schools, we will change human culture altogether. And this is no different than another hygiene that has become already implemented in our society. And I like this analogy. It's called dental hygiene. Back in the 1800s, a lot of children were suffering from cavities and they couldn't study because of the pain of this poor oral health. And it was understood that if you take care of your mouth, you brush your teeth, you do flossing and all of that stuff, you will have good dental hygiene. So this started way back at the beginning of the 20th century. They were teaching it in our schools. They were teaching dental hygiene. Our doctors teach it, our parents teach it, our dentists teach it. It's part of our culture. When you travel, You take a toothbrush, you wouldn't even think of not taking a toothbrush. It is that deeply embedded in our culture that everyone does dental hygiene, right? I mean, it's just accepted. It's part of our life. Obviously, you want to take care of your teeth. When we practice these techniques and teach mind-body hygiene, we will have yoga as embedded as dental hygiene is. It's a perfectly reasonable analogy. Instead of just taking care of our mouth, we're taking care of our entire mind and body complex. So this, I think, is feasible. And we need the research, of course, to demonstrate that yoga can be implemented effectively and produce substantial benefits in the schools. And I can tell you that our children are undergoing dramatic deficits in mental health, in behavior, and in physical health. So we have epidemics of obesity and diabetes. We have behavior like bullying, and we have depression and anxiety. We have a suicide rate in our kids. So mental health in our children is really suffering. And it's simply, they don't have the skills to cope with the stress of modern society and the stress of being a child and an adolescent in this culture. So these skills of yoga practice will provide exactly those skill sets.
Very powerful. And so you've been focusing on the public schools, as you mentioned, bringing yoga and meditation there, and also in parallel also to the workplaces and to the healthcare system. Can you tell us a little bit more also of these two areas? Why are they so critical to focus on?
Absolutely. So clearly, the workplace is another place that we can implement this, and this is working directly with adults. There are a lot of deficits in the workplace. There's a lot of job turnover. There's a lot of stress in modern society. You could actually say that there's an epidemic of chronic stress in modern society, and this is reflected in the workplace. So we have been applying yoga for workplace environments and showing that we can reduce stress, we can increase resilience, we can increase mindfulness. And ultimately, that will convince employers that we're actually increasing productivity and we're reducing job turnover. And all of the other positive benefits that will do in a workplace. So one area of great interest has been yoga in healthcare workers, especially now with the COVID epidemic, where healthcare workers are even under more stress. And the whole idea of burnout in healthcare providers, burnout in physicians has been a big issue even before COVID. And now with COVID, it's even gotten worse. So the whole idea of doctors undergoing huge amounts of stress and burnout is a major issue in modern medicine. So we've actually conducted a couple of trials in Harvard Medical School doctors with a 6-week yoga intervention and found that indeed we got statistically and clinically significant reductions in perceived stress and improvements in resilience and improvements in mindfulness. And then we also looked at medical residents, Harvard medical residents, and they also experienced similar kinds of benefits. So bringing yoga into the workplace, I think, is a valuable strategy. But of course, if they got it in schools, we wouldn't have to bring it into the workplace. But it nevertheless is valuable to do it into the workplace. The other area, of course, is healthcare. And what we're talking about here is yoga as a therapeutic intervention and the benefits of yoga for treating disease states. So this is a sort of relatively new field for yoga. It's basically been called yoga therapy. It's not part of yoga historically. I mean, yoga was never a form of medicine historically. It was a spiritual practice. However, the fact that it's working on these multiple levels to improve functioning both physically and mentally, obviously, it was considered that disease is basically malfunctioning. So basically, if we can practice yoga, we can restore functioning to optimal levels. So we see the first implementation of yoga as therapy at the beginning of the 20th century, and that happened in India. And just like yoga came to the West, yoga therapy came to the West as well. So now we have a large group of individuals who are using yoga for therapeutic purposes. We have in the United States the International Association of Yoga Therapists. They credential yoga therapy schools. They accredit yoga therapy schools, and they credential yoga therapists. So this is now becoming a field of medicine. And along with that is a large body of research on yoga therapy. And this has been growing dramatically over the past 15, 20 years. It's growing exponentially, just like the popularity of yoga has been growing. It grew so much that in 2016, we published a medical textbook called The Principles and Practice of Yoga in Healthcare. And this was an edited medical textbook. We brought in 60 of the leading yoga researchers around the world to contribute chapters that describe all the research in all of these areas. So there's chapters on yoga for cancer, yoga for diabetes, yoga for hypertension, cardiovascular disease, yoga for depression, yoga for anxiety. And this is really our face to modern medicine. Basically, we're arguing through this research that ultimately this shouldn't be embedded into the medical system. And this whole area of yoga therapy research is really a part of a broader field called integrative medicine, complementary and integrative medicine. The idea that these supplementary practices can work hand in hand with conventional medical practices to improve patient health even more. In some cases, yoga practices can be a cure for a disease. And so one thing that I'm thinking about in this line is insomnia. It's quite possible for people to embrace a practice of yoga intensively and actually take care of their insomnia. In some cases, in some disorders, yoga is not going to be considered a cure and should not be talked about that way. So for example, cancer. There's an enormous amount of research on yoga for cancer patients. Now the goal of this research is, and nobody's saying this, that yoga can cure cancer. The purpose of that research is to help the patients cope with the cancer diagnosis, the cancer itself, and the cancer treatment. So obviously getting a cancer diagnosis is a life-threatening disease. That's enormous stress and anxiety and sleep problems. And so yoga can address those facets. And you don't want to give cancer patients more drugs to deal with that because they're already on chemotherapy. So yoga provides a behavioral intervention that allows them to cope with that. Not only that, but being a life-threatening disease, there's a whole importance here of spirituality, because they are looking at the possibility of their lives ending. And so something like the spirituality in yoga can be really helpful, especially in palliative care. And then there's the treatment of the side effects of chemotherapy and surgery and radiation. People experience nausea. They experience the fatigue from the chemo brain stuff. And yoga has been shown to improve those side effects. So there's a huge body of research now looking at both yoga patients and cancer survivors, providing these benefits to these patients as a complementary therapy to assist with their conventional treatment.
So I've heard you speak in the past about the healthcare system as it is now and this kind of divorce between the mind and body, that you go to the psychologist for the mind and you go to internal medicine for the body. And I'm wondering if you have any insight into how the whole healthcare system could be reimagined so that there's a marriage rather than a divorce.
Yeah. So there's two aspects to the healthcare system that really are questionable. One of them is this divorce between the mind and the body. So the psychiatrist sees patients with quote unquote mental conditions, so depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, and they work with the mind. They don't care about the body. They don't even ask about the body. It's not part of their realm. Their realm is the mind, psychiatrists. And then there's the internist. The internist works on diabetes, glucose regulation, or he works on high blood pressure. I mean, he views these things as entirely physical. There's no mental components. And we know that everything that happens in the mind is reflected in the body and vice versa. So these quote unquote purely mental conditions like anxiety and post-traumatic stress disorder have a whole litany of physical manifestations and symptoms. Sleep problems, physical tension, irritability, and hyperactivity of the autonomic nervous system. These are all physical manifestations. And all of these so-called just purely physical disorders are associated with a substantial amount of stress and anxiety and mood disturbance. And so to treat these disorders just as a physical disorder, as just as a mental disorder, is very limiting. And yoga works on both the mind-body complex. So that's one of the limitations of modern medicine, is that, the doctor treating you for hypertension is not going to ask how your sleep is or how much stress you're under. And the same thing with the mental health professional. He's not going to ask about your sleep or your physical tension or how much physical activity you get. But these things are extremely relevant. So that's one limitation in modern medicine, is that these professionals are all in these silos. We have these separate departments, and they're all separated, and they don't talk to each other. The other problem with modern medicine is that we have been enamored with our scientific progress. You know, the cure of these major diseases, the plague, smallpox. I mean, we've cured these diseases through modern science and technology. And modern science has just gone crazy over this. Now, everything is viewed as there must be a miracle cure that we can come up with modern science. So there must be a pill that can cure obesity. And there must be a pill that can cure type 2 diabetes. And there must be a pill that can cure depression. And the problem is that many of these disorders, in fact, the majority of major medical conditions in modern society are due actually to behavior. These are called non-communicable diseases, as compared to communicable diseases like COVID or smallpox or the cold or the flu. These are non-communicable diseases. These diseases come about because of lifestyle behavior. People don't exercise, they eat poorly, they eat too much fat, they have too many calories, they smoke excessively, they drink excessive alcohol. These are the causative problems and then the chronic stress, which is unmanaged. These are the problems that cause these non-communicable diseases. They are responsible in modern society for 90% of all healthcare costs.
90%.
This is the majority killer in the world. COVID, forget COVID. This is killing 15 million people a year. I mean, this is the major burden in modern medicine. And it's due to behavior and lifestyle, okay? So modern medicine's focused on technology, the miracle cure, the pill, or the surgery that will fix this or fix that. You know, I've got type 2 diabetes, just give me a pill, I don't want to have to do anything. That's the attitude in modern medicine. And it's promoted by modern medicine because modern medicine is focused on pharmaceuticals and surgeries. It's called the acute care model. You see the doctor when something breaks down. And what we need to shift to is a prevention model, a model in which people are maintaining their health and behavior so they don't get these diseases in the first place. Now, this obviously makes sense to everyone that you talk to about it, but it doesn't make sense from a global perspective in the way the medical system is organized. The medical system is geared towards rewarding more pharmaceuticals and more surgery and more miracle cures. And they're very poor at changing behavior. In fact, the primary thing that the doctor says, if he says anything, is that, you know, Mr. Jones, you've got type 2 diabetes. If you don't change your diet and exercise more, you're going to die. So it's guilt and fear. That's it. And now guilt and fear doesn't work very well because you're not giving people the resources to change their behavior effectively. And improvements in mindfulness and managing of stress is exactly that. So yoga is a very powerful tool for prevention. That's what we need to really cure this epidemic of NCDs, not the pill or the surgery. We need to treat it up front. We need to change people's behavior, and yoga can do that. So that's where this integrative medicine really fits in. And the most powerful contribution of yoga to modern medicine really, I think, is going to be in prevention. And prevention, as they say, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Why not change your behavior now? Why wait until you're 45 to get type 2 diabetes? Start your activity and your exercise and your proper diet now. And yoga enhances that. The increase in mindfulness changes behavior. When you become more sensitive to your mind and your body, you become more sensitive to what you're doing with your mind and your body. So right now, people can smoke a pack of cigarettes and think nothing about it. People can drink a liter of sugar water and a soda and think nothing about it. But you know that after you've practiced yoga for a few months and you do something like that, you almost keel over because you're so sick from that behavior. You can't tolerate that behavior. And you gravitate to behaviors that make you feel good, like exercise, like proper food. So yoga changes behavior, not from the top down like modern medicine is trying to do, with a prescription, do this, do that. It's actually from the bottom up. People change their behavior because they can't tolerate the negative behaviors anymore. and they get rewarded for the positive behaviors because they experience the positive benefits more acutely. So this is how yoga can really provide something that modern medicine is really in need of at this point in time.
Bottom up.
And so if we would take the current situation with the coronavirus, for instance, what has been interesting in the evolution of research is that recently the Harvard Medical School published a recommendation of practicing yoga, meditation, and pranayam to cope with coronavirus anxiety. Could you guide us through some of the direct and indirect effects of those practices in that context?
Well, certainly, and that's reflective of, for example, what I was talking about yoga for cancer patients. Anxiety is huge in these patients. So COVID is associated with a potential death. It's associated with a lot of stress. The lifestyle restrictions that we're experiencing with COVID, the wearing masks, the social distancing, the people becoming unemployed. This is extremely stressful. It's like any disaster. If there's an earthquake or a hurricane, we know that there's a huge amount of stress. I mean, there's actually been studies looking at the benefits of yoga practice after disasters like that. This is a disaster as well, and it's associated with stress and anxiety as well. And we know from a number of studies that yoga works very well with anxiety and stress. And it works via self-regulation of emotion. So when you have anxiety disorder, you're worrying. You're worrying about the future. You're worrying, will I get COVID? Will I be exposed when I, go to the grocery store? Will I be exposed if I go to see my grandmother? Will I expose my grandmother? Will she die? I mean, these are all worry, anxiety. And as you have these thoughts, you react to those thoughts. And then it gets worse and the thoughts continue, and suddenly you have anxiety disorder. The thoughts that you have in anxiety disorder are not just an output of some kind of mysterious disorder. Those thoughts are actually part of the mechanism of the disorder itself. That means that if you are capable of then controlling those thoughts and reducing your reactivity to those thoughts, the disorder itself goes away. This is basically metacognition. This is why cognitive behavioral therapy, which also is a modern form of psychotherapy, is so very, very effective, because it deals with this whole idea of self-regulation of thought processes, as does meditation. So this is how we achieve this improvement in anxiety and stress regulation with this. And we just published a trial, actually, a major trial that was published in the Journal of the American Medical Association Psychiatry Journal, a large trial, 3-arm trial. We compared a Kundalini Yoga intervention with cognitive behavioral therapy, the gold standard for treatment of anxiety disorder, with a control group of stress education. Now, the cognitive behavioral therapy came out strongest, but the yoga showed clinically significant improvements in generalized anxiety disorder. So indeed, it does work for many patients for this disorder. And we need more research. And the more research we acquire and the stronger this research is, when we publish in strong journals like JAMA, that's going to start changing medical policy. And then ultimately you'll see a paper published which is policy recommendations. And yoga will be rated in terms of its the research that's been done as to whether it's a credible therapy to prescribe for physicians to prescribe to their patients. So it's really critical on the research. The more research that we have, the more we can see these policy statements. We already have policy statements from strong research that's been done on yoga for low back pain and yoga for cancer patients. There are 2 consensus statements that have been published rating yoga as a potential therapy for these disorders.
In looking at one type of yoga that you've been practicing for a very long time, Kundalini, we have here in the audience also a lot of Kundalini practitioners. What effects, for instance, do a combined practice of the mudra, the mantra, the pranayam, the asana have on us?
Well, Kundalini Yoga is very much a traditional component. All those 4 components that I described in there, the postures, the breathing pranayam, and the deep relaxation, and the meditative component. In addition, we have so many other things in Kundalini Yoga. It's very much a spiritually oriented practice. We have a lot of very specific kriyas and mantras and mudras that we use in many different types of meditations that have been taught. So we have a large repertoire of practices that have been targeted towards specific functions in the body and in the mind. So for example, we have this one practice called Shabad Kriya. It's a breathing meditation that includes a mantra. I actually used this in a clinical trial for chronic insomnia, and we showed positive benefit. So these practices have a wealth of these kinds of recommendations, and we can test all of these things out. But being such a traditional practice focused on internal growth, really very much focused on transformation, that's what makes it so powerful for medicine and for human behavior, for that matter. So I view that it has an enormous potential. And a colleague of mine, Shanti Shantikar, has the director of the Guru Ram Das Center for Medicine and Humanology. And her mandate and her expertise is applying Kundalini Yoga specifically for disorders. And so they are an accredited yoga therapy school, and they train yoga therapists using Kundalini Yoga practices. And in fact, I've worked very closely with Shanti Shantikar. She helped develop the protocol, a Kundalini Yoga protocol for post-traumatic stress disorder. And we published a clinical trial of that with high degree of success in Toronto. And then she also created the stress protocol that we used in a trial and data that we're analyzing now. And then for this JAMA Psychiatry paper, it was a Kundalini Yoga protocol for generalized anxiety disorder that we used in this trial. So I think Kundalini Yoga has a substantial potential for being very helpful in a therapeutic way.
Fantastic. Just popping back for a moment, you've spoken a bit about this topic of emotional maturity or emotional intelligence, and that it's not something that's inculcated into our school system and into our society it's coming slowly as a value in the workplace or in the school systems. I'm curious, how would you motivate a wider population and specifically the youth to take up yoga from this bottom up, as you said?
Well, I think it can be practiced in very, very young children. I mean, my wife teaches preschoolers. Now, of course, you're not teaching preschoolers these complicated mantras and postures and mudras. They're doing animal poses, and they're learning how to be quiet. And she can take a bunch of kids who are bouncing off the walls, and then 30 minutes later, they're all lying on their backs in total silence. I mean, if you think about 3 to 4-year-olds, that's a miracle in itself. That these children can learn that degree of self-regulation, that they can learn to quiet themselves. And through these animal they practice being a lion and so on. So you make it fun for the kids, and they are learning mind-body integration at a very fundamental level. And that mind-body integration is self-regulation of internal state, both physical and psychological, which leads to this whole idea of stress and emotion regulation. So it's really fundamental, and it's very simple. And the idea is that you can do this on 2 levels. You can make it part of the mandatory school curriculum, which I believe should happen. So all of the kids have to take it. I mean, all the kids have to take math. Why not yoga? You have to take math because you have to be able to add 2 numbers together. You have to practice yoga because you have to be a mature emotional individual. So I believe it should be mandatory. So if it's mandatory, everyone will get it, and they can use it, and they will experience the positive benefits. The other way to talk about it is to talk about, are you depressed? What are your problems? Are you anxious? Are you stressed? Try this yoga practice. Try this particular meditation. Try this particular kriya. And see if it works for you and see if it helps, and offer it as this. And of course, we're doing that. You walk around the city and you see posters for Kundalini Yoga classes, and they might say on the poster, help with your stress. And they say, wow, I need some help with my stress. And they go to the yoga class. This is what's happening. This is the word of mouth that's happening, that's causing this 14% of the population to practice yoga. People aren't practicing yoga because they read a research study. They're practicing yoga because their neighbor told them that they were going to a yoga class and it made them feel better. So this is how this is growing now. But if we can put it into the schools, to me, that That's the most powerful place that you could put this.
So make it mandatory and make it fun. And
Well, of course, it's got to be fun. Well, of course, math is mandatory too, and if the teacher makes it more fun, he's going to be a better math teacher. Good teaching can't be replaced. I mean, a bad yoga teacher is a bad yoga teacher, and a bad math teacher is a bad math teacher. You need good teachers in everything. So absolutely, you need to teach it properly.
Wonderful. Well, then last question for you, Satvir. You have said once you make a better functioning human, you get a better society. So what could we do, each of us here in the audience and around us, what could we do our own scale to support that process?
Teach yoga. I mean, that goes without saying. I mean, and this is what happens to many people that experience this powerful transformation when they say, yoga changed my life, and I need to share this. I must share this. There's a need that comes from this. When they see people around them suffering from their emotions and their stress, and they are not, there's suddenly, I can help this, and I can teach yoga. So that is it. Share it, teach it. And of course, all of the yoga teachers who came from India were doing the same thing. They came from India because they saw what was going on in America. They saw that we didn't have, in the West, we didn't have these practices. So that's why they traveled here from India, changed their lives, and started these yoga lineages and practices. It's service to humanity. You've benefited, and now you need to share that benefit. I mean, I think that's a fundamental human sort of act of kindness and compassion, that if you have experienced something and a benefit, you want to share that with somebody else. Because, as humans, we don't like to see our neighbors suffering. I mean, we have the solution, we should share it. And it's as simple as that.
beautiful, the ultimate message of compassion and evolving out of suffering into this unitive state.
In service to humanity. Well, thank you so much, Satvir. What a wonderful hour with you. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Satnam.
Satnam. Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.
It was a pleasure.